Chapter 1. The Weight of the Mud. The mud in Missouri was not just dirt and water, it was a living thing. It sucked at boots, coated wagon wheels in thick clay-heavy layers, and seemed determined to pull everything back down into the earth. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of what used to be his blacksmith shop, watching the rain carve rivulets through the grime on the window pane. The sign that had once hung proudly above the door, Thorne and Son Ironworks, was already down, leaning against the peeling white paint of the siding. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was a man who knew how to bend iron, how to shape the hardest materials with fire and force, yet he had been bent and broken by something as insubstantial as paper. Debt. It was a quiet killer. It didn't roar like a furnace or ring like an anvil. It crept in during the lean winter of '47, compounded by the bank panic and the drying up of local trade. Now the bank held the deed, and Elias held nothing but a handful of promissory notes and a heart heavy with failure. Elias? He turned. Sarah was standing in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked tired. The shadows beneath her eyes seemed to have deepened in the last month, ever since the decision was made. She was 30, but the hard frontier life had already begun to etch fine lines around her mouth. "The buyer is here for the anvil," she said softly. Elias flinched. Selling the shop was one thing, selling the anvil was another. It was his father's. It was the heart of his trade. "I told him I wouldn't take less than $50. "He has 45, Elias, and he has cash." Elias looked out at the muddy street of St. Joseph, just north of Independence. He looked at the gray sky that seemed to mirror his future. If they stayed, he would be a tenant in his own town, working for another man, slowly drowning in the stagnation of a life that had passed him by. But out west, the rumors had been swirling for years, carried by trappers and the early erratic mail. Oregon, the Willamette Valley, land that was black and rich, trees that touched the clouds, and a climate where the fever didn't take your children in the night. It was a terrified hope, a desperate gamble. "Take it," Elias said, his voice rasping. "Take the 45. We need every cent for the oxen." As Sarah turned to leave, Elias looked at his hands. They were calloused, stained permanently with soot. They were hands meant to build. "I will build something new," he promised himself, though the fear in his gut was cold and hard. "I will not die a debtor in this mud." Chapter 2. The Jumping-Off Point. Independence, Missouri, in May of '48 was not a town. It was a cacophony. It was the edge of the known world, the jumping-off point where civilization dissolved into the vast, terrifying prairie. 2 weeks after selling the shop, the Thorne family arrived in Independence. The noise hit them first. The air vibrated with the lowing of thousands of oxen, the sharp crack of bullwhips, the chaotic hammering of wheelwrights, and the shouting of men speaking a dozen different dialects. It was a hive of humanity. Dreamers, scoundrels, preachers, and families, all swarming around the great outfitters. Elias guided their wagon, a sturdy, canvas-topped construct that was now their only home, through the congested streets. Sarah sat beside him, holding their 6-year-old son, Toby. The boy's eyes were wide, darting from a group of Kansa Indians trading furs to a rough-looking mountain man with a beard like a bird's nest. "Keep close," Elias muttered, guiding the mules through a gap in the traffic. "This place is a fever dream." They found a patch of high ground near the river to make camp. It was a sea of white canvas. Hundreds of wagons were parked wheel to wheel, smoke rising from countless campfires, blending with the smell of wet wool, manure, and frying bacon. "We need supplies, Elias," Sarah said, climbing down. She smoothed her dress, trying to maintain dignity in the chaos. "The list is long." The list was their Bible. 200 pounds of flour per person, 150 pounds of bacon, coffee, sugar, salt, dried fruit. Elias nodded. I'll go to the outfitter. You check the wheel wegs again. If that rear axle has a crack, we don't move a mile." Walking into the general store was like walking into a riot. Men were climbing over barrels, shouting orders. The prices were robbery, inflated by the sheer demand of the migration. "Flour is up to $3 a hundredweight," a man shouted near the counter. "Take it or leave it, friend," the clerk replied, not even looking up. "There's 1,000 souls behind you who'll pay 4. Elias fought his way to the front. He had the money from the anvil, the house, and everything they owned sewn into the lining of his vest. He felt the weight of it against his ribs. It was a terrifying amount of money to carry, yet it bought so little. He spent the next 3 hours haggling, sweating, and hauling. Barrels of flour, sacks of cornmeal, heavy slabs of bacon packed in bran to keep the fat from melting in the summer heat. He bought lead for bullets, gunpowder, and a spare wagon tongue. By the time he returned to their wagon, the sun was setting, turning the muddy Missouri River into a ribbon of molten copper. Sarah had a fire going. She was boiling beans, but her face was pale. "What is it?" Elias dropped a sack of coffee near the wheel. "I spoke to a woman from Illinois," Sarah said, stirring the pot. "She said they buried 3 children last week. Cholera, it's in the camp." Elias froze. Cholera was the specter that haunted the trail. It struck fast and killed without mercy. "We keep to ourselves," Elias said firmly. "We boil our water, we wash, and we leave. We leave as soon as the grass is high enough." "Is it worth it, Elias?" She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "We are leaving the graves of our parents. We are taking Toby into the wilderness. If something happens to him..." Elias knelt beside her. He took her hands. They were rougher than they used to be. "Look around you, Sarah. Look at these people. They're not running away. They're running toward. If we stay, we are nothing. Out there, we have a chance to be free, to be independent." Sarah looked at Toby, who was chasing a stray dog near the wagon tongue. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Then we leave soon." Chapter 3. The Wagon Master. A wagon train was not a democracy. It was a military unit born of necessity. Alone, a wagon was a target for bandits, for natives, for the elements. Together, they were a fortress. 3 days later, Elias attended the organizational meeting at a large clearing near the town square. About 40 men gathered, representing 40 families. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and nervous energy. At the center stood a man who looked as if he had been carved from oak, Captain Silas Vance. He wore buckskins that were black with grease and age, and a heavy pistol sat on his hip. He had been a trapper in the Rockies before the beaver trade died, and now he guided greenhorns across the great American desert. "Listen up," Vance's voice cut through the chatter like a whip crack. "I don't care who you were back east. I don't care if you were a banker, a judge, or a thief. Out here, you are a teamster, you are a guard, you are a nurse." He paced the circle, looking every man in the eye. When he stopped in front of Elias, his gaze was assessing. "You, what's your trade?" "Blacksmith," Elias said, straightening his back. Vance nodded. "Good, we'll need that. Can you shoot?" "I can hit a rabbit at 50 paces. "A Comanche rides faster than a rabbit and shoots back," Vance grunted. He turned to the group. "Here are the rolls. We rise at 4. We roll at 6. We stop for nooning to rest the oxen for 1 hour. We circle up at sundown. No stragglers. If your wagon breaks and can't be fixed in an hour, we leave it. If you get sick and can't move, we leave you. The winter snows in the Sierras don't wait for funerals." A murmur of unease went through the crowd. "Harsh," Vance spat on the ground. "The Donners were late. You know what happened to them 2 years ago? They ate each other. I intend to get you to Oregon with your souls intact. Do you sign the compact?" Elias stepped forward. There was a piece of parchment on a barrel, the constitution of their traveling company. It laid out the guard duties, the order of march, which rotated daily so no one ate dust every day, and the criminal codes. Elias took the quill. He signed. Elias Thorne. It felt like signing a declaration of war against the world. That night, Elias worked by lantern light. He was stripping the wagon of anything non-essential. The heavy oak dresser Sarah loved, gone. The box of books, reduced to the Bible and a primer for Toby. "The oxen can't pull the weight," Elias explained gently, as Sarah wept over a box of porcelain teacups. "They were my mother's," she whispered. "I know." Elias felt a lump in his throat. He took one cup out, a delicate thing with blue flowers. He wrapped it in wool and tucked it deep into the flour barrel. "One, we keep one, to remind us of where we started." Sarah wiped her eyes and nodded. She stood up, her jaw set. She picked up the rest of the box and walked to the edge of the camp, where a pile of discarded furniture from other wagons was.
Part 1. The Green Sea. For the first week, the Oregon Trail felt less like a struggle for survival and more like a grand, chaotic picnic. The weather held. The Missouri storms that had turned Independence into a mud pit gave way to a brilliant, overarching blue sky that seemed to stretch into eternity. The land here, just west of the border, was a rolling ocean of emerald green. The prairie grass was high, knee-deep in some places, waist-deep in others, and rippled in the wind like waves on the Atlantic. Elias Thorne walked beside his oxen, Buck and Bright, listening to the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the hickory wheels. The air was sweet, smelling of crushed wild onions, clover, and the loamy scent of disturbed earth. "It's beautiful, Elias," Sarah called down from the wagon seat. She had pushed her bonnet back, letting the sun touch her face. For the first time in years, the pinch of worry between her eyebrows had smoothed out. "It is," Elias agreed, wiping sweat from his neck with a rag. "Land as far as you can see, and not a fence post in sight." The wagon train, 42 schooners strong, stretched out for nearly a mile. In these early days, spirits were high. The oxen were fresh, their coats sleek. The wagons were still painted bright blues and reds, not yet scoured by sand or bleached by the sun. Children ran alongside the wheels, picking wildflowers, verbena and spiderwort, weaving them into garlands for the milk cows that trailed behind. It was during these easy evenings that the society of the trail began to form. When the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in violent violets and oranges, the wagons would circle up. Fires were lit, fiddles were pulled from cases, and the illusion of a traveling village took hold. Elias and Sarah found themselves drawn to the fire of the Kincaids. Dr. Arthur Kincaid was a man who looked as though he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a university lecture. He was tall, thin, and wore spectacles that constantly slid down his nose. His wife, Martha, was a bird-like woman, delicate and perpetually startled, who seemed to view the prairie as a personal affront to her upbringing in Boston. "It is the reopening of Eden," Dr. Kincaid declared, gesturing with a pipe that he rarely managed to keep lit. "Look at this soil. You could plant a walking stick here and it would sprout leaves by morning. We are not merely travelers. We are the vanguard of civilization." Sitting across from him was a stark contrast, the widow Moore. Agatha Moore was a woman carved from granite. She was traveling with her 3 grown sons, big, silent men who moved with the lumbering grace of bears. Agatha smoked a corncob pipe and wore men's boots under her calico skirt. "Civilization," Agatha scoffed, spitting into the fire. "Doctor, this land don't care about your civilization. It don't care about your poetry. It only cares if you can keep your powder dry and your axle greased. You talk too much about the soil and not enough about the rivers." "Mrs. Moore is a pragmatist," Kincaid smiled, unbothered. "But surely even you must feel the romance of the journey." "Romance don't pull a wagon," she grunted. She looked over at Elias. "You're the blacksmith, right?" "I am," Elias said, looking up from whittling a toy boat for Toby. "Check your king bolt," she advised. "Terrain is getting uneven. I saw your wagon wobbly on that last ridge. If that bolt shears, you're done." Elias nodded respectfully. "I'll check it, ma'am."
Sarah sat closer to Elias. She liked the Kincaids. They represented the refined life she missed, but she feared the widow more because she suspected the old woman spoke the truth. The illusion of the picnic lasted exactly 6 days. On the 7th day, the horizon changed. A line of dark trees appeared, cutting across the green prairie like a scar. "River!" the shout went up from the outriders. It was the Kansas River, the Kaw, and it was angry. Part 2, The Barrier. The Kansas River was the first true test. It was a wide, muscular body of water, swollen by the spring melt from the distant Rockies and heavy local rains. It churned brown and thick, carrying driftwood, uprooted trees, and clots of foam. Captain Silas Vance called a halt 100 yards from the bank. The noise of the water was a low, constant roar that vibrated in the chest. Vance rode his horse up and down the line, his face grim. "All right, listen up. This ain't a creek. It's too deep to ford. We ferry the women and children on the raft. The wagons, we float 'em." A ripple of anxiety went through the crowd. "Float them?" Dr. Kincaid asked, stepping forward, his boots sinking into the river mud. "My wagon is laden with books, medical instruments. They cannot get wet." "Then you should have stayed in Boston, Doctor," Vance snapped. "We have one raft operated by the Poppin brothers, French half-breeds who run this crossing. It takes an hour a trip. If we ferry every wagon, we'll be here 3 days. We don't have 3 days. The cholera is behind us, and the snow is ahead of us. We swim the stock, and we float the schooners." Elias felt a cold knot in his stomach. He looked at his wagon. It was heavy with iron, his anvil, his hammers, the tools of his trade. Iron did not float. "Jed!" Vance shouted to one of the scouts. Jedediah Rook was a wiry man with one eye and a scar running from his ear to his chin. He chewed tobacco with a ferocity that suggested he was angry at it. "Yeah, Cap? Get the men to the banks. Show 'em how to caulk. If a wagon takes water, it sinks. If it sinks, it's gone." The next 2 hours were a frenzy of labor. The picnic was over. Elias worked with a desperate intensity. He melted down extra resin and mixed it with tallow. He crawled under his wagon, forcing the sticky black mixture into every seam of the wagon bed. He wrapped the bottom of the wagon with buffalo hides he had traded for, lashing them tight to create a makeshift hull. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight, "you and Toby go on the ferry." "No," Sarah said. She was standing by the oxen, holding the lead rope. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. "The ferry costs $1. We need that $1. "Sarah, if this wagon tips, if it tips, we lose everything anyway," she cut in. "I'm staying with the wagon, Elias. I can handle the brake. You need to be with the oxen." Elias looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the steel. She was right. He couldn't drive the team and manage the wagon's buoyancy at the same time. "All right," he whispered. "Tie Toby to the seat with a rope. If we go over, I want him attached to something that floats." Part 3. Into the Current. The crossing began at noon. The sun was high and hot, baking the mud on the banks into a humid crust. The first few wagons went across without incident, though the sight of the oxen swimming, only their noses and horns visible, eyes wide with panic, was disturbing. The wagons bobbed like corks, the water lapping dangerously close to the rim of the beds. Then it was Elias's turn. "High up! Get in there!" Elias shouted, cracking his whip in the air. Buck and Bright hesitated. They smelled the water. They knew the danger. "Go!" Elias slapped Buck on the rump. With a groan, the great beasts plunged down the muddy bank. Splash! The water hit the wheels, first the hubs, then the axles. The wagon lurched, the floorboards tilting. Elias waded in beside them. The water was shockingly cold. It grabbed at his legs, pulling him downstream. Within seconds, he was waist deep, then chest deep. "Swim!" Elias roared at the oxen. "Swim, damn you!" The oxen lost their footing. Their heads went up, snorting water. They began to paddle. The wagon lifted off the riverbed. It floated. It was a sickening sensation, the stability of the earth gone, replaced by a swaying, lurching slide. Elias grabbed the yoke of the lead ox, treading water, keeping their heads upstream. "Keep the line tight, Sarah," Elias screamed over the roar of the water. On the seat, Sarah was white-knuckled. She held the reins, keeping the oxen from turning back toward the shore. Toby was crying, lashed to the bench, clutching his toy boat. The current caught them in the middle of the river. It spun the wagon slightly. Elias kicked hard, his boots heavy with water. He fought the river, fought the weight of the iron in the wagon bed. For a terrifying moment, the wagon dipped low on the left side. Water sloshed over the rim. "Lean right," Elias yelled. "Sarah, lean right." She threw her weight to the high side. The wagon leveled. They drifted past the worst of the current, the oxen finding purchase on the far bank silt. With a mighty heave, dripping and heaving, Buck and Bright dragged the wagon up the slope and onto dry land. Elias collapsed on the grass, gasping for air. Sarah untied Toby and scrambled down, shaking uncontrollably. They had made it, but the river wasn't done. "Help! Someone help!" The scream came from the water. Elias pushed himself up on trembling arms. It was the Kincaid wagon. Dr. Kincaid had refused to let his wife drive. He was trying to manage the oxen from the water, but he wasn't strong enough. He had lost his grip on the lead ox. The current had caught the schooner broadside. The wagon was spinning. The oxen were tangling in their chains, panicking, thrashing in the water. One of the oxen went under, dragging the other with it. "The rope!" Jed Rook shouted from the bank. "Throw the line!" Dr. Kincaid was flailing, trying to...
The architecture of night. The sun did not merely set on the prairie, it collapsed. One moment, the horizon was a bleeding wound of crimson and violet, and the next, the world was extinguished, swallowed by a darkness so absolute it felt heavy against the skin. 3 days had passed since the disaster at the Kansas River. The wagon train had moved out of the river bottoms and onto the higher, drier tablelands. The lush green was giving way to a tougher, coarser grass. The trees had vanished, save for the occasional lonely cottonwood standing like a sentinel near a dry creek bed. Camp was struck in a tight circle. This was no longer the haphazard gathering of the first week. Fear had disciplined them. The wagons were interlocked, tongue to wheel, creating a wooden corral for the livestock and a fortress for the people. Inside the circle, the night city came alive. Elias Thorne sat on a crate near his wagon, his body humming with a fatigue that went down to the marrow. His hands were black with grease from greasing the wheel hubs, a nightly ritual that could not be skipped. He wiped them on a rag, watching the flames of their small fire dance. Fuel was scarce. The wood was gone. They were now burning prairie coal, dried buffalo chips. Sarah had been horrified the first time she saw the widow Moore pick up the dry dung with her bare hands and toss it into a sack. Now, Sarah did it without blinking. The chips burned hot and clean, smelling faintly of sweetgrass. "Coffee's ready," Sarah said, her voice soft. She handed him a tin cup. The metal was hot against his lip. She sat beside him, pulling her shawl tight against the rapidly cooling air. The temperature swung 40 degrees between noon and midnight. "How is he?" Elias nodded toward the Kincaids, who were sitting on the other side of the fire. Since losing their wagon, Arthur and Martha Kincaid had become ghosts. They walked during the day, their boots, fine leather meant for city cobblestones, shredding on the grit. They slept under the Thornes' wagon at night. They ate what the Thornes and the Moores shared. "Martha is stronger than she looks," Sarah whispered. "She walked 10 miles today without complaint. But Arthur, he's mourning. He didn't just lose a wagon, Elias. He lost his identity." Elias looked at the doctor. Arthur was staring into the fire, holding a piece of hardtack bread but not eating it. He looked stripped, like a tree with its bark peeled away. "We need to bring them in, truly in. They can't just be guests. A man can't live on charity alone. It sours the stomach." Part 2.
the Council of Broken Men. Later that evening, the circle of light expanded. It was a custom that had developed naturally. Men and women would drift from fire to fire, seeking news, comfort, or distraction. Tonight, the widow Moore and her massive son, Caleb, joined the Thorns. Then came Jed Rook, the scout, who moved so silently he seemed to materialize out of the smoke. They sat in a rough circle. The firelight played tricks on their faces, deepening the hollows of their eyes and casting long, flickering shadows against the canvas of the wagon. "Doctor," the widow Moore rumbled. She took a pull from her corncob pipe. "You walked good today. Caleb says you kept pace with the lead team." Arthur Kincaid looked up, startled. Thank you, madam. One puts one foot in front of the other. It is a simple mechanic." "Simple ain't easy," Caleb grunted. It was the most he had said in 2 days. Jed Rook leaned forward, using his knife to poke the fire. The flames flared, illuminating the jagged scar on his face. "Saw a sign of Pawnee today," he said casually. "Just a scouting party, watching us." "Watching?" Sarah pulled her shawl tighter. "Will they attack?" "Not likely," Jed said. "They're assessing, checking our strength. Pawnee are smart. They don't fight unless the math is good." Elias looked at Jed. "You know them well?" Jed chuckled, a dry sound like leaves scraping pavement. "I lived with them for a winter, 10 back, up near the Loop Fork. I was trapping, got caught in a blizzard. Wouldn't have froze if a Pawnee elder hadn't dragged me into his lodge." "You lived with savages?" Martha Kincaid asked, her eyes wide. "But aren't they godless?" Jed looked at Martha, his one good eye narrowing. "Ma'am, that savage shared his last strip of jerky with me while the wind howled like a banshee. He taught me that the land isn't something you fight, it's something you read. We come out here with our Bibles and our wagons, thinking we're bringing light to the darkness, but sometimes the darkness knows more than we do." A heavy silence followed. It was the first time the civilized assumptions of the East had been challenged so directly. "I had a practice in Boston," Arthur Kincaid said suddenly. His voice was brittle. "A fine practice. Brick house, mahogany furniture. I was a deacon." Everyone turned to him. It was the first time he had spoken of his past. "I thought I knew everything," Arthur continued, staring at his blistered hands. "I had a patient, a young girl, influenza. I treated her by the book, bleeding, purging, the best medical science." He paused, his throat working. "She died. She died because I was too proud to try anything else. I was too proud to admit I didn't know." He looked up, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "I lost my patience. I lost my standing. We came west not to build a new world, but because the old one couldn't stand the sight of me. And now the river has taken my books, my instruments. Maybe the river knows too. Maybe it's telling me I don't deserve to be a doctor." The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Elias leaned forward. He picked up the coffee pot and poured a splash into Arthur's cup. "My father was a blacksmith," Elias said quietly. "Best in Missouri. He taught me that iron has a memory. If you hit it wrong, it bends. If you hit it too hard, it cracks. But if you put it back in the fire, if you heat it until it glows white, you can reshape it. You can make it stronger than it was before." Elias looked at Arthur in the eye. "Reshaped, Arthur. You're not a doctor because of the books in that wagon, Arthur. You're a doctor because of what's in your head and your hands. The river took your tools. It didn't take your knowledge. We have 40 families here. Children will get sick. Women will birth babies. Men will break bones. You think we care about your brick house in Boston? Out here, you're the only man who knows how to stitch a wound." Arthur looked at Elias. For a moment, the firelight seemed to reflect a spark in his dull eyes. "Reshaped," he whispered. "Aye," the widow Moore nodded. "We're all in the fire now, Doc. Every one of us. The question is, are you going to crack or are you going to temper?" Part 3. The Threads of Friendship. While the men spoke of duty and redemption, a quieter conversation was happening in the shadows. Sarah had moved to sit beside Martha. She handed the old woman a piece of dried apple. "Eat," she commanded gently. "I can't," Martha said. "I feel exposed. Without the wagon, I feel like a snail pulled from its shell." "I know," Sarah said. She looked at her own hands. They were rougher now, the nails broken. "Back home, my biggest worry was whether the curtains matched the rug. I used to cry if I burned a pie." Martha let out a watery laugh. "I used to cry if Arthur was late for dinner." Sarah smiled. "Look at us now, sleeping on the ground, eating off tin plates. But Martha, look up." She pointed to the sky. Without the light of cities, without the haze of coal smoke, the sky was a revelation. The Milky Way was not a smudge, it was a torrent of diamonds, a river of light that spanned the heavens. "It makes you feel small," Martha whispered. "It makes you feel free," Sarah corrected. "In Missouri, my life was written out for me. Wash on Mondays, market on Tuesdays, church on Sundays. Here, nobody cares who my grandfather was. Nobody cares that Elias lost the shop. I am just Sarah, and you are just Martha." Martha looked at Sarah. "You saved my life in the river. Why?" "Because you're my neighbor," Sarah said simply, "and because I might need you to save me tomorrow." Martha took the dried apple. She took a small bite. "I don't know if I can be like you, Sarah. You're brave." "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted. "Every night I listen to Toby breathing, and I pray the fever doesn't take him. I'm scared to death, but that's why we have to hold on to each other. The men, they have the guns and the whips, but we have to be the glue. If we fall apart, the whole train falls apart." Martha nodded slowly. She reached out and took Sarah's hand. It was the beginning of a bond that would survive droughts, blizzards, and death. It was the sisterhood of the trail. Part 4. The Music of Memory. As the night deepened, the tension in the camp began to ease. From a wagon 3 spots down, the O'Malley wagon, came the sound of a fiddle. It started slow, a mournful Irish lament that seemed to weep for the green hills left behind. Then the tempo picked up. It shifted into a reel, lively and bright. "That's
The Devil's Highway." The Platte River was a paradox. It was a mile wide and an inch deep. The pioneers called it too thick to drink and too thin to plow. It was a brown, sluggish ribbon that wound through a landscape so flat that a man could stand on his wagon seat and see the curvature of the earth. For 10 days, the wagon train had crawled along its banks. The lush green of the Kansas prairie was a distant memory. Here, the world was beige. Dust coated everything: the canvas, the oxen, the food, the back of the throat. It was a gritty, alkaline dust that cracked lips and made eyes water perpetually. The heat was a physical weight. It pressed down from a white, hazy sky, baking the earth until it radiated heat like a skillet. Elias Thorne walked beside his oxen, a wet rag tied around his face to filter the dust. Buck and Bright were suffering. Their heads hung low, their tongues lolling. Every step was a labor. "Water break!" The cry went down the line. The train shuddered to a halt. It wasn't noon yet, but the animals were foaming. Elias unhooked the water bucket. The river water was warm and clouded with silt. He let the oxen drink sparingly. Too much too fast would bloat them. "This is madness," a voice grumbled behind him. Elias turned. It was Thomas Miller. Miller was a young man from Ohio, strong, impatient, and increasingly vocal. He had gathered a small clique of younger men who felt that Captain Vance was an old woman, too cautious and too slow. "We stop every 2 hours," Miller spat, wiping muddy sweat from his forehead. "At this pace, we'll hit the snows in the Sierras for sure. We should be pushing until sundown." The
oxen can't take it, Miller, Elias said, patting Buck's flank. Look at 'em. You drive them harder, they die, and then you walkin'. Vance is afraid, Miller insisted, his eyes hard. He's afraid of the Indians, afraid of the heat, afraid of his own shadow. We need a leader who wants to get to Oregon, not one who wants to nursemaid us across the continent. Elias tightened the lid of his water bucket. Vance has crossed 5 times. You haven't crossed once. Miller sneered. Times change, Thorne. We're burning daylight. As Miller walked back to his wagon, Elias saw the looks on the faces of the other men. Miller wasn't alone. The heat was cooking their patience. The monotony was driving them mad. Rebellion was simmering in the dust, waiting for a spark. Part 2. The Sea of Black. The spark didn't come from the men. It came from the horizon. Around 2 p.m., a low rumble began to vibrate through the soles of Elias's boots. It wasn't thunder. The sky was clear. It was a constant, rhythmic trembling. Earthquake? Sarah asked, clutching Tobby on the wagon seat. Nah, Jed Rook appeared, riding his mule down the line. His face was lit with a grim excitement. Buffalo. They crested a low rise, and suddenly the world turned black. The valley ahead was filled with them, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. It was a living sea of fur and muscle, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sound was deafening, a mix of lowing, grunting, and the clattering of hooves that sounded like a hailstorm. The smell hit them next, a pungent, musky odor of wild beast and ammonia. Good Lord, Arthur Kincaid whispered, staring through his cracked spectacles. It is biblical. The wagon train halted. The oxen were nervous, smelling the wild herd. Miller rode up to the front, flanked by 3 of his supporters. He pulled his rifle from his scabbard. Meat, he shouted. Fresh meat, boys. Let's ride. Hold your fire, Captain Vance's voice cracked like a whip. Vance rode between the wagons and the herd, his horse dancing nervously. Nobody shoots, you hear me? Nobody. Are you crazy, old man? Miller yelled. There's enough beef there to feed us to the Pacific. There's enough power there to grind this train to dust, Vance roared back. Look at 'em. They're moving north. They're thirsty. If you spook 'em, they stampede. If they stampede, they run right over us. We are a pebble in a landslide, Miller. You fire a shot and you kill us all. The confrontation was sharp and dangerous. Miller raised his rifle, his finger hovering near the trigger. The herd was only 300 yards away, a massive wall of shaggy humps. Put it down, Elias said. He had stepped away from his oxen, his own rifle in hand. He wasn't pointing it at Miller, but he was holding it ready. Listen to the captain. Miller looked at Elias, then at Vance. He saw the widow Moore standing on her wagon box, a shotgun across her lap. He saw the fear in the eyes of the women. With a curse, Miller lowered his gun. You're throwing away a fortune. I'm saving your life, Captain Vance growled. Circle the wagons, tight, double-lock the wheels, chain the oxen to the inside. Move! The urgency in Vance's voice wasn't just about the buffalo. While the men had been arguing, the sky had changed. In the west, behind the buffalo herd, a wall of clouds was building. It wasn't the gray of a rainstorm. It was a bruised, angry purple, undershot with a sickly, luminous green. The green sky was a sign every plainsman feared. It meant hail. It meant tornadoes. Move! Move! Elias shouted at his team. The wagons lurched into a defensive circle. Usually they corralled for the night. Now they were corralling for survival. They interlocked the wheels, chaining them together to form a solid barricade. The heat spiked. The air became thick and static. The hair on Elias's arms stood up. Sarah, get inside, Elias ordered. Put the mattress over Tobby. Stay low. What about you? Sarah gripped his arm. The wind was picking up now, whipping her face across the hair. I have to stay with the oxen. If they panic, they'll break the chains. Elias, go. He shoved her gently toward the canvas opening. He turned to check the rigging. The atmosphere was electricity. Elias looked at the tips of the oxen's horns. Tiny blue flames were dancing on them. St. Elmo's fire. The cattle were tossing their heads, their eyes rolling white with terror at the buzzing sound coming from their own bodies. "Steady, Buck, steady," Elias murmured, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. To the west, the buffalo herd was getting agitated. The approaching storm was making them restless. The sea of black began to swirl. Then the sky cracked open. Part 4. The Hammer of God. It didn't start with rain. It started with wind, a gust so powerful that it rocked the heavy wagons on their springs. The canvas covers snapped like gunshots. Then came the lightning. It wasn't a bolt, it was a bombardment. Forks of white fire stabbed the earth all around them. The thunder was continuous, a physical assault that vibrated the teeth in Elias's skull. Crack! Boom! A bolt struck the ground 50 yards from the circle, exploding a patch of sagebrush into flame. "Here it comes!" Jed Rook screamed under a wagon. The hail hit. Stones the size of marbles, then the size of eggs. They hammered the canvas, sounded like 1,000 drummers beating the diff march. Elias crouched under the neck of his lead ox, using his own body to shield the animal's face. The hail struck his back, bruising him through his coat. The pain was sharp, shocking. The oxen were screaming now, a terrible high-pitched bellowing. Inside the circle, horses were rearing, kicking out. But the real danger was outside. Through the curtain of hail and rain, Elias looked out between the wagon wheels. The buffalo were moving. The thunder had panicked them. The herd had turned. They were no longer moving north. They were running, a blind, unstoppable avalanche of panic. And they were running straight for the wagons. Part 5. The Stampede. "They're charging!" Miller's voice shrieked over the wind. "Fire!" Captain Vance shouted. "Fire into the air! Turn 'em!" Elias grabbed his rifle. He scrambled up onto the wagon tongue. The rain was torrential, blinding, but he could see the dark wall approaching. The ground shook so violently that Elias had to lock his legs around the wagon brace to stay upright. He raised his rifle and fired into the air. Bang! All around the circle, men were firing. Bang! 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 Muzzle flashes bloomed in the gray chaos. But the herd was too big. The front ranks were being pushed by the thousands behind them. They couldn't stop if they wanted to. "They're not turning!" Caleb Moore yelled. "We have to split 'em!" Jed Rook appeared at Elias's elbow. The scout's face was wet, his one eye wild. "We have to go out there." "Out there?" Elias stared at him. "That's suicide. If we don't, they crush the wagons flat. We have to create a wedge. Come on." Jed jumped over the chains and ran into the storm, waving a blanket and firing his pistol. Elias looked back at the canvas where Sarah and Tobby were hiding. He looked at the wall of fur approaching, only 100 yards now. He didn't think. He vaulted the wheel. "Yeah! Get back!" Elias screamed, running into the mud. He joined Jed and Captain Vance, who had also run out. They stood about 30 yards in front of the wagons, 3 tiny figures against a tidal